In the 1960s West Virginia, the average coal mining family spent under $9 a week feeding 7 mouths. They lived on cornbread and pinto beans, and one iron pot kept 10 plates warm through a 6-day shift. Number 21 on this list fed a family for under $1 a serving. Number 12 stretched a pound of salt pork across 4 suppers. Number 5 on this list was the meal coal camp wives cooked the morning their husbands didn't come home. These were not recipes anyone wrote down. They were what poverty taught women to do with what was left in the pantry, against the math of a paycheck that ran out by Thursday. So hit subscribe and pull up a chair, because here are 60 forgotten one-pot meals poor hillbilly families ate to survive. Number 22. Pinto beans simmered all afternoon. This is the dinner that runs the rest of the list, because the pot sits at the back of the stove from 1 in the afternoon until 5 and asks for almost nothing. A cup of dry pintos soaked since the night before, cold water just over the top of the beans, a piece of streaked side meat about the length of a thumb, a quartered onion, no salt at the start, because salt at the start keeps the bean skin tight, and a tight skin will not let the broth in. The pot goes on the stove with the burner turned so low that one bubble breaks the surface every 10 seconds. That is the rate, and it does not change for 3 hours. The kitchen begins to smell of pork and onion at the 2nd hour, and by the 3rd, the broth has turned the color of strong tea. Salt goes in only at the end, and a slosh of vinegar goes in with it. The beans come off the heat and rest in their own broth for 15 minutes before the first spoonful, because the bean keeps cooking on the way to the bowl. A half cup of dry pintos makes 2 suppers for 1 person. The leftover beans the next day are better than the first, and the broth is what most people overlook, because the broth is where the whole pot put itself. A wedge of cornbread crumbled and turns the bowl into a meal that no restaurant in any city has ever quite produced. A senior in Hancock County, Tennessee, who has been doing this since 1956, will say that the pot teaches patience to the person who tends it, and that patience is the missing ingredient in modern cooking. The dish is one of the cheapest in the American repertoire, and at the same time, it is the most filling. That is the trick the cookbooks never quite captured, because the trick is the time. Number 15. Canning 365 jars of green beans every summer. The smell of vinegar and steam in an Appalachian kitchen in August was the smell of survival being put up by the quart. Your great-grandmother stood in a hot kitchen for 10 days every summer, snapping beans on the porch by morning, blanching them in a black canner by 10, packing ball jars by noon, and lowering them into a boiling water bath that ran until dark. 365 jars, 1 a day for the year. The math was the year. The part most people forget is that the jars were not extra. They were the budget. She used a pressure cooker she had bought in 1949 for $11, jars she washed every season, and lids she bought for 49 cents at the IGA. Her husband cut the wood that fired the stove. Her oldest daughter washed jars in scalding water. Her youngest carried the canner to the porch. Every jar she sealed was a winter night that would have a vegetable on the plate. The seller held them by row, by date, by category, and a handwritten ledger pinned to the door tracked what came in and what went out. By April, the rows were empty and the gardens were going back in. The ledger was your family budget for the cold months, written in jars instead of dollars. Today, a can of green beans at the grocery costs you around $1.50, while a home-canned quart runs about 30 cents to put up. 300 jars is $450 in winter food your family does not have to buy. Every Appalachian woman who stood in that hot kitchen knew the arithmetic of August. Real quick before number 14, if any of these tricks remind you of your grandmother's kitchen, I put together a recipe guide with more dishes built the same way. The cornbread, the soup beans, the dried apples, the milk gravy. The link is right below this video. Number 19. Self-rising flour mixed at home from plain flour. The town store in Blairsville sold Martha White self-rising flour for 22 cents, more a bag than plain flour. Jewel did the math. She bought plain white lily flour in 25-pound sacks and mixed her own every Monday morning. 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of salt for every cup of flour. She blended it in a crock and kept it covered on the pantry shelf. Over a year, the savings added up to a pair of work boots, which in 1955 ran $7.95 at the Sears catalog. Nobody in town talked about it, because the women who did it had been taught by grandmothers who could not always read a label. They were not about to pay someone else for something they could mix in a crock. It is still the simplest hack you can teach your daughter in under 2 minutes. Number 20. Peanut butter potato candy. Here is a candy that began as 2 ingredients and stayed that way for 80 years. 1 cold, boiled potato, 2 cups of powdered sugar worked in by hand until a white dough came together under your palms. You rolled it out thin on a floured board, spread peanut butter over the whole sheet, rolled it up like a jelly roll, cut it into coins, pinwheels of brown and white, sweet enough to set your teeth aching. A single potato, a 2-pound bag of sugar from the company store, and a jar of peanut butter made enough candy for a church social of 50. Mrs. Nora Lewis of Mingo County, West Virginia, made it every Christmas Eve from 1944 until 1989. Her grandchildren still fight over the recipe card. 4 lines long. One of them has it framed. Number 22. Skillet cornbread with buttermilk. Every hillbilly kitchen in West Virginia, Kentucky, and East Tennessee had the same ritual. A black cast-iron skillet lived on the middle rack of the oven. You preheated it with a spoonful of bacon grease inside. When the grease popped and smoked, you poured the cornmeal batter in and listened for the sizzle. The bread baked in 22 minutes flat. The bottom came out crisp and dark, the top was golden, and the edges pulled away from the skillet clean. You crumbled it into a glass of cold buttermilk and ate it with an iced teaspoon. A miner's wife in Letcher County could make this in 15 minutes between the time the children came home from school and the time the whistle blew. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal fed a family for 10 days. The buttermilk came from the grocery in a paper carton, 29 cents a quart. It was simple, cheap, and transformed a handful of meal into a meal. Number 19. Leather breeches. This was not a snack in the way a modern person thinks of a snack. But in the early 1960s, mountain families pulled leather breeches off the string hanging from the porch ceiling and chewed on them the way a person today might chew on beef jerky. Leather breeches were green beans, threaded onto a long piece of string with a needle, then hung to air dry for weeks. The beans shriveled and turned brown and leathery. The name came from the way they looked, like tiny pairs of leather pants on a clothesline. The practice likely came from the Cherokee, though German settlers in the Palatinate had a similar tradition. By the 1960s, they were a winter staple in the mountains of North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky. When you were hungry between meals, you pulled a few off the string and chewed. They were tough and earthy and tasted like summer gone quiet. Most families kept several strings drying at once, each one holding enough beans to last a month. That was the whole point of them, not flavor, survival. The knowledge that when the snow came and the garden was dead and the nearest store was 12 miles of frozen road away, there was still food hanging from the ceiling. In Watauga County, North Carolina, a woman named Ora Mae Ward strung leather breeches on her front porch every August for 40 years. Her grandchildren would sit on the steps and help thread the beans, and she would tell them stories about the winters when the only vegetables came from that string. Those strings are gone from most porches now. The skill went with them. The grandchildren who sat on those steps are grandparents themselves now, and most of them have never threaded a single bean. But the taste, for anyone who remembers it, never left. It never will. Number 21. Buttermilk candy. Not many people have heard of buttermilk candy outside the rural South, but in the farm communities of central Georgia and the flatlands of West Tennessee, it was on the Christmas plate every single year. It starts like fudge, sugar, butter, and heat, but the buttermilk changes everything. The acid reacts with baking soda and creates a candy that is lightly tan, almost caramel-colored, with a faint sourness underneath the sweetness. It tastes like nothing else. Grandmothers in those communities described it as what fudge would taste like if fudge had a little more character. A cup of buttermilk cost almost nothing. A woman who kept a milk cow had buttermilk every day for free. This was the candy she made when she wanted something that tasted like home. Your grandmother knew what she was doing when she made it. Pot liquor was the liquid left in the pot after a long cook of greens with pork, dark, glossy, smelling of collards and ham and something mineral underneath. In mountain households, it was not a byproduct to discard, but a dish in its own right, poured into a tin cup and drunk while the greens were being plated, or used to soak the cornbread so it could carry more flavor to the mouth per bite. The mineral content was genuinely high. A long cook drew calcium, iron, and B vitamins from the greens that would otherwise be lost. And mountain people understood this without nutritional vocabulary, but with hard practical knowledge passed across generations. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt entered a public debate about whether pot liquor should be drunk as broth or sopped with cornbread. A moment that tells you something about how seriously this liquid was regarded. The ones who knew it best always drank it straight from the cup first, still hot enough to steam. When she left the kitchen for the last time, that cup went cold, and nobody thought to fill it. Either one. Salt-rising bread was not made on a schedule. It rose when it wanted to. An honest description of bread that relied on naturally occurring bacteria captured in cornmeal, milk, and salt, left to ferment overnight near the wood stove. The smell alarmed anyone who had not grown up with it. Sharp, cheesy, faintly like old feet. And that smell meant it was working. Baked, the crumb was dense and tangy, the structure tight enough to toast to a hard golden crunch. Buttered while hot, it was an event. Salt-rising bread originated in Appalachia as a solution to expensive commercial yeast, and mountain bakers in West Virginia and Kentucky had kept the skill alive since before the Civil War. By the 1970s, the women who still made it by feel, reading the smell to know if the ferment had turned, were running short on apprentices. You did not learn it from a cookbook. You stood in the kitchen and watched and smelled, or you never learned at all. Red-eye gravy required exactly two things: country ham and black coffee, the stronger the better. You fried the ham, pulled it out, poured a cup of dark coffee over the hot drippings, and scraped the browned bits loose as it hissed. 3 minutes. Done. Some people in Appalachia called it red sop, and the name came from the reddish ring the coffee and fat left at the skillet's edge, darker on the outside, lighter in the center, like an eye. Country ham had been a staple in Virginia and the Mountain South since colonial times, and the tradition of deglazing ham drippings with coffee likely came from Scots-Irish settlers who wasted nothing and never saw a reason to change. You poured it over grits or biscuits, and the bitterness of the coffee cut the salt and fat in a way that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. But the quick suppers didn't end with ham. Beneath all that smoky pork lay a whole world of mountain resourcefulness, where garden scraps and foraged food and vegetables nobody else wanted carried as much weight as any cut of meat. The first frost came fast in the mountains and killed whatever was still green overnight. Cabbage roll casserole was what happened when a woman loved the flavor of stuffed cabbage but had 4 kids to feed and no time to roll anything. The original stuffed cabbage came from Eastern European immigrants, Polish, Czech, Hungarian families who settled across Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley to work the mines and the mills. Their wives rolled seasoned meat and rice inside blanched cabbage leaves and simmered them in tomato sauce for hours. The casserole version took the same ingredients: ground beef, chopped cabbage, rice, condensed tomato soup, and a pour of beef broth, and layered them raw in a baking dish. It went into the oven for 90 minutes and came out tasting like somebody had been cooking all day. You never told company it only took 15 minutes to assemble. That was the unspoken rule of country casserole cooking. The less effort it looked like, the more it impressed, and nobody ever asked how you pulled it off. Number 24, hot water cornbread, cornmeal, and a pinch of salt in a tin bowl, boiling water poured over, stirred until it just holds together as a thick paste. Patted into 3 small cakes and fried in hot bacon grease until the edges are lace. Kratos Williams, the Appalachian scholar from Watauga County, wrote that hot water cornbread was the first supper a child learned to make, and the last one an old widow stopped making. There is no egg, no buttermilk, no leavening, and the recipe survived 2 centuries of mountain winters because it works with whatever is left in the cornmeal sack. 3 cakes feed 1 person well, with 2 left over for breakfast, cold and crumbled into coffee. The dish has lived in the mountains since before the railroads came, and it has not changed its shape since. Number 19. Cooking pinto beans from a 25-pound sack. Soaking 2 cups of beans overnight in a stoneware bowl was the first move every Sunday night in a hillbilly kitchen. Your grandmother bought a camellia or pinto brand sack at the IGA for under $4 in 1965. The IGA and Hazard sold the same camellia bag every Friday. She drained the soaked beans Monday morning, slid them into a heavy iron pot with a piece of fat back, covered them with 3 inches of water, and let the rear of the wood stove do the rest of the work all day. By supper, the beans were tender, the broth was thick like a slow river, and the smell had pulled the children to the kitchen door an hour early. The pot fed 7. The leftovers fed them again on Tuesday. The same long simmer still works in your kitchen. The math has not changed in 60 years. Number 17. Drying apples on a window screen in the sun. The apples came off the 2 old Arkansas black trees behind Jules' barn the 3rd week of September 1955, about 6 bushels between them. She peeled and cored and sliced them into 8 wedges each. She laid the wedges on 2 old window screens set up on sawhorses out on the front porch. The screens let the air move around every slice. A piece of cheesecloth on top kept the flies off. She turned the slices once a day for 5 days. By the 6th day, they were brown, leathery, and shrunk to 1/3 of the original weight. She tied them up in clean cotton flour sacks and hung them from the ceiling beams of the cabin. Through winter, those dried apples became stack cakes, fried pies, and sweetness in a pot of sweet potatoes. No jar, no sugar, no heat, no power. Just the sun. A bag of store-bought dried apples at the A&P cost 34 cents in 1955. Jules spent 0. That is the whole argument for a screen on a sawhorse. Number 15. Coffee soup over crumbled biscuit. Here is the part of the list where some of you are about to think I am making it up. I am not. Coffee soup was a real dessert, eaten in real kitchens across the southern mountains for 3 generations, and for many older Appalachian people, it is still the taste that means home. A cold leftover biscuit, a bowl, a pour of hot coffee, thinned with warm milk from the cow, sweetened with a heaped teaspoon of sugar or a thick drizzle of sorghum. A grown man ate it at the end of the evening meal. A child was given a small cup of it before bed on a cold winter night. Here is what I want you to see, and this is the thing most modern people miss. Coffee soup was not a joke, and it was not a hardship trick. It was a comfort. A bitter grown-up drink, softened with milk and sugar, poured over the last piece of something their mother had baked that morning. An old man in Letcher County, interviewed for a Foxfire oral history in 1977, said he ate coffee soup 4 times a week for 60 years. He never once thought of it as poor. He thought of it as his. These small, strange desserts were the taste of a specific life. They were not reminders that a family had little. They were reminders that a family had each other at a table, at the end of a hard day, with a warm cup and a piece of bread. That is the whole sermon of hillbilly sweet making, and you will find it under every item on this list if you look close enough. Number 16. Cat head biscuits. These were called cat head biscuits because they were the size of a cat's head, big and soft and pulled apart with 2 hands. In a coal camp kitchen in McDowell County, West Virginia, a woman named Mavis Blevins made 6 of them every morning before 5 when her husband left for the Pocahontas mine. 2 cups of self-rising flour, 1/3 of a cup of lard, 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk. She patted the dough out on a board dusted with flour, pinched off 6 equal chunks, pressed them flat with her palm, and slid them into a hot oven. 15 minutes later, they came out tall, golden, and shaped by a woman's hand instead of a biscuit cutter. Her husband took 2 in his lunch bucket every day for 19 years. She never once missed a morning. Now here is the part that most people miss about a coal camp kitchen. These biscuits were never only about breakfast. They were how a working wife told her working husband that she was still there, still awake at 4:30, still paying attention, even when the wage slip from the mine was thin and the company store ledger was thick. In Mingo, Logan, and McDowell counties, a cathead biscuit was a love letter baked in a skillet. The flour was 39 cents for a 5-pound sack. The lard was $4 for a 3-pound tub that lasted 6 weeks. The buttermilk was 29 cents a quart. A breakfast that cost less than a dime said something no greeting card could say. And that is why, when the children grew up and moved to Columbus or Cincinnati for the auto plant jobs, the first thing they asked their mothers to mail them was a cathead biscuit wrapped in wax paper and cold by the time it arrived. Number 18. Pawpaw fruit. Every September, in the shaded creek bottoms across Appalachia, the pawpaw trees dropped their fruit. Children knew exactly where the trees were. They guarded those locations the way other children guarded a fishing hole. The fruit was roughly the size of a mango, with a thin green skin that bruised easily. Inside, the flesh was yellow and custard soft, with a flavor somewhere between banana and mango. You ate it raw, standing under the tree, spitting out the large brown seeds. There was no way to store a pawpaw. It ripened for about a week and then it was gone. That narrow window made it precious. In Mingo County, West Virginia, families planned their September around pawpaw season. Grandmothers made pawpaw bread. Children ate them until their stomachs ached. And then the season ended. The pawpaw was never cultivated commercially because it could not survive shipping. Too soft, too fragile, too brief. The only people who ever tasted it were the people who lived near the trees. In the hollows along the Tug Fork River, a man named Dewey Blankenship kept a pawpaw grove on his property that his grandfather had tended before him. Every September, neighbors walked to his land with paper sacks, and he let them pick without charge. He never sold a single fruit. He said it was not his to sell. The trees were there before his family arrived, and they would be there after he was gone. Your children will probably never taste a pawpaw. That is not because the trees disappeared. It is because nobody walks to them anymore. Number 16. Peanut butter no-bake cookies. In communities where firewood was scarce or the summer heat made the kitchen unbearable, no-bake cookies weren't a shortcut. They were a solution. The base recipe, sugar, cocoa, butter, and milk boiled together, then stirred into oats and peanut butter and dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper, was common in coal mining families across West Virginia, Kentucky, and western Pennsylvania from the 1950s onward. You didn't need a working oven. You didn't need baking powder or eggs. You needed a single pot and about 10 minutes. Women who worked double shifts at textile mills in the Piedmont kept the ingredients ready so they could make them in the time between coming home and putting the children to bed. No bake, no wait, no oven required. Crackling cornbread was what happened when nothing went to waste. After rendering lard from fresh pork fat, a process that left behind small, crispy browned bits of skin called cracklings, those bits went straight into the batter. You mixed white cornmeal, baking soda, buttermilk, and a beaten egg, folded the cracklings in, and poured the whole thing into a cast iron skillet that had been greased and heated in a 425-degree oven until nearly smoking. The batter hitting that hot iron produced a low, satisfied hiss, the sound that told you the crust was already forming. The cracklings distributed through the loaf as it baked, each one holding a pocket of rendered fat that kept the surrounding crumb moist and gave the finished bread a texture somewhere between ordinary cornbread and something with no name. Crackling cornbread appears in the Foxfire Book of Appalachian Cookery as one of the most widely remembered dishes of mountain households, from West Virginia down through northern Georgia. The skillet was the whole secret. Cold pan, flat bread. Hot pan, something worth remembering. Pie and an RC Cola carried a price and a history. The marshmallow-filled graham cracker sandwich coated in chocolate or banana, paired with Royal Crown, cost under a dime apiece at the company store. The moon pie was created in 1917 at the Chattanooga Bakery in Tennessee when a traveling salesman visited a coal camp and asked what miners wanted. Something big, filling, cheap enough to eat on a break. They held their hands in a circle and described it the size of the moon. By the 1970s, Every mountain child knew the ritual. One bite of moon pie, then a long pull of cold RC. The carbonation cut through the marshmallow in a way no other drink could match. Pepsi was wrong. Coke was wrong. RC was the one. Old men at the filling station did this the same way on a Tuesday in 1972 they had in 1952. When the company store closed and the stool went with it, the man who always sat there went too. The moon pie is still on the rack. The rest of it is gone. Hominy is corn soaked in an alkaline solution, wood ash, lye, or slaked lime, until the outer hull loosens and the kernel becomes something entirely different, a process called nixtamalization that the Cherokee and other Native American nations had practiced for centuries before European settlers arrived in the Appalachian Mountains and learned it from them. The alkaline treatment unlocked niacin that dried corn could not release on its own, and the settlers who adopted it kept their families healthier without knowing exactly why. By the 1950s, most Appalachian families got their hominy from a can. Van Camp's was the brand most kitchens stocked, warming it in a skillet with butter and cracked black pepper. Old-timers remembered when it was supper itself, heaped into a bowl, eaten hot enough to steam. The flavor was different from grits, blunter and chewier, and anyone who grew up eating it never confused the two. It was its own thing, and the people who understood that distinction are mostly gone. Before there were freezers, before there were pressure canners, there were shucky beans, green beans strung on thread with a needle and hung from porch rafters until they dried into something that looked like shriveled leather and smelled like the memory of summer. The Cherokee are often credited with teaching settlers the practice, though German immigrants from the Palatinate brought a near-identical tradition called Getrocknet Bohnen, and somewhere in the mountains the two methods became one. To make the casserole, you soaked the dried beans overnight, then simmered them for hours with a chunk of fat back until they turned silky and rich, deeper than fresh green beans, almost tannic, tasting of smoke and thyme and the barn roof where they dried in August heat. A cornbread batter poured over the top and baked until golden turned it into a one-dish meal. What started as a way to survive winter became the dish families requested at every holiday. Number 27. Soup beans and skillet cornbread. A cup of dry pinto beans soaked overnight, then simmered all day with a chunk of smoked ham hock, an onion, and water that just covers them. By supper time, the broth has thickened on its own and turned the color of a strong tea. A wedge of cornbread crumbled in is the only addition. The dish scales down without effort. 1 cup of dry beans yields 4 single suppers, and the pot reheats better on the second day than the first. Sydney Saylor Farr put it at the center of her 1983 book on mountain cooking, and Loyal Jones wrote that the smell of the pot was what a hill country grandmother smelled like on a Saturday evening. For a senior eating alone in a hill country kitchen, no other dinner returns this much warmth for so few coins. Number 21. Stretching whole milk with water and powdered milk. The smell of cold milk mixing with warm carnation powder filled every coal camp kitchen the night before payday. A box of Carnation Instant Non-Fat Dry Milk from the IGA cost 95 cents and made 8 quarts, while a gallon of fresh pet whole milk at the company store ran 75 cents. Your grandmother poured the fresh milk into a pitcher, added cold water and a half cup of dry powder, stirred it with a long-handled spoon, and slid the pitcher into the icebox overnight. By morning, the children could not tell the difference, and that was the whole reason of the trick. The cereal still got cold milk. The biscuits still got buttermilk poured the way they always had. The gravy still set up the same. Today, a gallon of whole milk costs around $4, and the math still cuts your milk bill in half. It was not a secret because anyone hid it. It was a secret because the children were not supposed to find out. Number 24. Seasoning cast iron with hog lard. Jules Skillet was 22 years old in 1955. Her husband's mother had given it to her in 1933 as a wedding gift. It had never been washed with soap, and it never would be. Once or twice a year, she rubbed a thin layer of rendered hog lard inside it, set it upside down over the open firebox of the cook stove, and let it bake until the smoke stopped rising. That was the old way, passed down through generations. Every meal built another layer of black on the iron. The surface turned glassy. Nothing stuck, and her skillet was not a pan anymore. It was a record of every meal ever cooked in it. But what most people miss is that a properly seasoned skillet outlasts 3 non-stick pans from the store. Jules' daughter still uses that same skillet today. You can season your own the same way, with the same hog lard. A powerful tool, passed down without a receipt. Number 22. Sugar on cornbread with sweet milk. This was not a company dessert. This was what a child got when a child was loved and there was nothing else. A wedge of hot cornbread broken into a thick china bowl, a teaspoon of white sugar if it was a holiday, a drizzle of sorghum if it was not, a pour of warm cow's milk over the top, from the family cow, still faintly tasting of grass. The child ate it with a big spoon, sitting on a kitchen chair that was too tall, legs swinging. In Knott County, Kentucky, this was called cornbread and sweet milk. In Letcher County, they called it crumblings. In parts of West Virginia, they called it cornbread soakey. The name depended on the ridge. The feeling was the same. You do not forget the first time someone hands you something warm and sweet and tells you it is all for you. Number 21. Fried taters and onions. The potatoes were left over from last night's supper, cold and already peeled, sitting in a bowl on the back of the stove. You sliced them thin, threw them into a cast-iron skillet with a yellow onion and a spoonful of bacon grease, and let them crisp up while the coffee perked. 12 minutes, start to finish. Hillbilly families in Wise County, Virginia, ate this for breakfast, for lunch, and sometimes as the whole supper when payday was still 3 days out. Potatoes were a nickel a pound at the Greenbrier Valley Piggly Wiggly. An onion was 2 cents. A pan of fried taters and onions fed 4 children and 2 adults for under 20 cents. There was nothing beautiful about it on the plate, but it smelled like a coal camp Saturday morning, and it was hot, and it filled you up until the mine whistle blew at noon. Number 13. Persimmon pudding. The wild persimmon trees across the hills of southern Appalachia produced small orange fruit that looked inviting and could ruin your afternoon. An unripe persimmon contains so much tannin that a single bite will pucker your mouth shut. Mountain people knew to wait. They waited for the first hard frost because the cold broke down the tannins and turned the fruit honey sweet. After the frost, families collected persimmons by the bucketful. The fruit was mashed through a colander to remove the seeds, and the pulp was mixed with eggs, milk, sugar, and flour, then baked into a pudding that came out dense, dark, and sweet. Not quite pumpkin, not quite sweet potato, something entirely its own. In Grayson County, Virginia, women competed over whose persimmon pudding was the best. There were no written recipes. Every family had its own version, passed down through generations, adjusted by feel and the specific sweetness of that year's frost. The pudding was never sold. It was never served in any restaurant. It existed only in the kitchens of people who knew where the trees grew and had the patience to wait for the cold. In Floyd County, Virginia, a woman named Edith Spangler baked her persimmon pudding in the same brown stoneware dish her mother had used. She walked the ridgeline above her house every November, checking the trees, pressing her thumb into each fruit to test the softness. The year the frost came late, she waited until December. She said you could not rush a persimmon, and you could not rush the Lord, and they were often on the same schedule. That patience was the ingredient no recipe could capture. Number 17. Buckeyes. Named for the nut of the Ohio State tree, Buckeyes are chocolate-dipped peanut butter balls that became a Midwest tradition starting in the early 1960s. The original version used nothing more than peanut butter, powdered sugar, and a little butter worked into a dough, rolled into balls, and dipped partially in melted chocolate so that a circle of the peanut butter filling showed at the top, just like the real Buckeye nut. Home economists in Columbus and Dayton documented the candy in church cookbooks as early as 1960. A pound of peanut butter cost about 35 cents. A bag of chocolate chips added another 20 cents. The whole batch made 40 to 50 pieces. That is candy for a family of 6 for under 60 cents, and it looked like something that took far more effort than it did. That gap between how hard it looked and how easy it was is something your grandmother understood very well. Before there was a smokehouse on the property, and many families never had one, There was the salt box, and it did the same work by different means. After the November butchering, cuts that couldn't be eaten fresh went into a wooden box packed with dry salt. The rule was absolute. Every surface had to be covered, pressed in by hand to leave nothing exposed. Salt packing drew out the moisture bacteria needed, working slowly until the meat was stable enough to last well into the following summer. A whole ham might need 4 to 6 weeks under salt, smaller slabs of side meat, 2. The salt was often cut with brown sugar and a little saltpeter, a formula passed by watching, never by measuring. In 1930s Appalachia, a 50-pound bag of plain salt cost less than $1 and was one of the most critical purchases made each fall. The salt box required nothing but cold air, the salt, and the knowledge of how thick to pack it. That last part was the hardest thing to hold on to. Cracklins in a paper bag were not pork rinds, and any mountain child would tell you so without blinking. Real cracklins came from hog butchering day, the skin and fat layer cut into squares, dropped into a boiling lard kettle, and cooked until they puffed and turned golden, the outer shell shattering when you bit through to a chewy, fatty center that tasted like concentrated smokehouse and fire. Shaken in a paper bag with salt while still hot, eaten by the handful while the kettle was still going. There was no second batch, only what came off that hog that day in that yard. The Cherokee in Appalachia had long rendered animal fat as both food and medicine, and European settlers adopted the total-use butchering practice. Fat became lard, skin became cracklins, bones became broth. Store-bought pork rinds are puffed with air and dusted with powder. Cracklins were dense, dark, bitter at the edges where the fat caramelized against the iron. The women who knew how to render them slow are mostly gone. The kettle rusted. A moon fatback had no glamour. It was the part of the hog nobody else wanted. Pure white fat salted and stored in a crock. But in Appalachian kitchens from the 1930s through the 1960s, it was the engine of every meal. You sliced it thin, laid it in a cold skillet, and let it render slow. By the time the slices went brown and rigid at the edges, the pan was full of clear golden fat worth more than the meat itself. The crackling slices got eaten, salty, crunchy, intensely porky, but the drippings went into a jar by the stove that was never empty if the family was doing all right. A half-pound of fatback cost a few cents at the company store in coal towns across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, and it seasoned every pot of beans, every skillet of greens, every pan of cornbread for a month. You didn't measure. You poured until the color looked right, and if you had to ask what that meant, you hadn't spent enough time watching. The jar by the stove was the first thing to disappear when the next generation moved to town. She kept the canned salmon on the second shelf behind the pinto beans, and she only brought it down on Fridays. Salmon patty casserole was a Friday night staple in country homes where the pantry did more work than the icebox. The canned salmon, bones, skin, and all, got mashed with cracker crumbs, an egg, and a little grated onion, then pressed into a greased baking dish instead of shaped into patties. A can of cream of celery soup thinned with a splash of milk went over the top, and the whole thing baked until it bubbled and firmed up enough to slice. Some women laid sliced boiled eggs across the middle before pouring the soup over, a trick that made the casserole look planned instead of pulled together from what was on the shelf. The woman who taught you this is probably gone now. The canned salmon is still at the store, but nobody reaches for it the way she did, quick and sure, like she already knew what supper was before she opened the pantry door. Number 25. Killed lettuce over a hot-baked potato. A bowl of leaf lettuce, sliced green onions, and a little salt. Hot bacon grease with a splash of cider vinegar gets poured directly over the leaves, and they wilt down in seconds. The whole bowl tips onto a split-baked potato. 1 potato, 1 handful of lettuce, 2 strips of bacon broken in. The Foxfire books recorded this as a spring supper across the Blue Ridge and the Smokies, gathered from hill country grandmothers in Rabun County and Macon County in the early 70s. It is sharp, hot, and finished in the time it takes the potato to come out of the oven. A solo plate sets up in 5 minutes flat, and the lettuce can be from a kitchen window planter through most of the year. Number 16. Tearing day-old bread into hot milk for a paid-for supper. Tearing yesterday's biscuits into a saucepan with warm milk was the supper a coal camp mother served on the nights the cupboard was bare otherwise. She poured 2 cups of pet whole milk into the pot, tore 4 hard biscuits into thumb-sized chunks, and stirred in a spoon of sugar, salt, and a slice of butter from the icebox. 3 minutes over a soft burner. The bread softened into something between pudding and porridge. She ladled it into chipped enamel bowls and set the children at the table. They called it bread and milk in Letcher County, and a whole pot fed 4 for under 15 cents in 1965. The supper that fed 4 bellies to bed full is still the cheapest meal in your kitchen tonight. Number 18. Salt-rising bread leavened by wild microbes. This was the loaf that nobody else in Jules Holler could make anymore. She kept a starter going from her grandmother's time, a mash of cornmeal, warm milk, and a pinch of salt, left overnight in a crock wrapped in a wool blanket behind the cook stove. By morning it smelled sharp, like very ripe cheese, and it hissed faintly when she opened it. That smell meant the wild bacteria, Clostridium perfringens, was alive and working. She did not know the Latin name of the microbe. She knew the crock had to stay at blood temperature, about 104 degrees, for 16 hours or the starter would die. Salt-rising bread has no yeast. It is leavened by hydrogen gas from a wild bacterium found in flour itself, and the technique was invented by pioneer women in these mountains in the 1770s, before yeast was sold in packets at the store. The earliest recorded recipe dates to 1778 in what is now West Virginia. The loaf is dense, white, almost cheesy. Jewel baked 2 a week and traded 1 to the neighbor who kept her in sorghum. What most people miss is that every woman on Coosa Creek who knew this starter learned it from a woman, back to the Scots-Irish women who carried wheat flour over the Blue Ridge and had no yeast at all. That tradition almost died with Jewel's generation. If your great-grandmother was Appalachian, she likely knew the smell. You can still start one tonight with cornmeal and a warm place to hide it. Number 24. Sorghum molasses cookies. You have to understand something about sorghum to understand why these cookies existed. Sorghum is not molasses. Sorghum is the juice pressed out of a tall cane-like grass, boiled down in a flat pan over a wood fire until it turns the color of dark honey and tastes like a field at dusk. A gallon of it in 1962 cost $1.50 from the neighbor up the road who owned the mule and the press. A gallon of white sugar cost 4 times that at the store in town, and town was a 2-hour drive. So you used what you had. Mrs. Arlie Burgess in Clay County, West Virginia, made a tin full of sorghum cookies every Saturday for 51 years. Flour, lard, sorghum, soda, ginger, a pinch of salt. She rolled them thin as a dime and baked them on the stove. The children got 2 each after supper. But her grandchildren, grown now, still say they have never tasted anything sweeter. That is not an exaggeration. That is memory doing what memory does. Number 19. Pinto beans with fatback. The beans soaked overnight in a chipped enamel pot. The fatback, a white slab of salt pork streaked with pink, went in at sunrise with a diced onion and a quart of water. You set the burner to low and walked away. By 4 in the afternoon, the kitchen smelled like smoke and simmered beans, and the pot liquor at the bottom was thick enough to sop up with a biscuit. A pound of pintos cost 29 cents in 1974. A quarter pound of fatback cost 15 cents. The meal fed 5 people for under 50 cents a day. In Buchanan County, Virginia, women made this on Mondays because it lasted 3 days and the flavor deepened each time it was reheated. It was cheap, it was simple, and it held a working family together across a week. Number 24. Moon pie and RC cola. In 1961, you could walk into any general store in the mountains of Virginia, Tennessee, or Kentucky and buy both for a dime. The moon pie cost a nickel. The RC cola cost a nickel. Together, they made what working people called the working man's lunch. The Chattanooga Bakery had been making moon pies since 1917. 2 round graham cracker cookies with marshmallow in the middle dipped in chocolate, vanilla, or banana coating. One moon pie had enough calories to carry a man through an afternoon of splitting wood or hauling rock. The RC Cola washed it down. This was not a treat. This was fuel, and for 10 cents, it was the cheapest fuel in Appalachia. Number 24. Caramel corn. On farm kitchens across southern Ohio and northern Kentucky, popcorn was the one crop that always came through. A family could grow a single row and have enough to pop all winter. The caramel that went over it was made in the same heavy pot used for everything else: sugar, sorghum, or molasses, a spoon of butter, a pinch of salt, cooked to the hard crack stage, poured over a pan of popped corn, and spread out to cool on greased butcher paper. The whole batch cost less than 15 cents in 1963. What made it special wasn't the recipe. Every family had the same recipe. What made it special was the night it got made, usually a cold night, usually a Friday, usually with the radio going and children underfoot. Farm families in the Hocking Hills of Ohio and the hill country of eastern Kentucky shaped the same mixture into popcorn balls, wrapped them in waxed paper, and set them in a row on the windowsill like little amber moons. She made the mush at night when supper was done because it needed all night to set. Cornmeal went into salted boiling water and she stirred it until it thickened past porridge, dense enough to hold the spoon's path for a moment before closing. A process that took 40 minutes of constant attention. She poured it into a bread loaf pan, smoothed the top flat, and left it on the counter until morning. By dawn, it had firmed into a sliceable loaf. She cut it into half-inch slabs and fried each one in bacon grease until the outside was golden and crisped, while the inside stayed soft. Called mersh by some families in the hill communities of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, fried cornmeal mush was food that required nothing special and wasted nothing. Every bit left from supper became something better at breakfast. The crackle of the crust is what the children who grew up on it still remember. Their grandchildren do not know the dish exists. Old biscuit with cane syrup needed no recipe, just a leftover cat head biscuit from morning, gone cool on the back of the stove, split with a thumb, filled with a slow pour of sorghum from a tin with a hinged lid. The biscuit soaked it from the inside out. You held it over the sink because it ran. Some families pressed butter in first, so it sealed. Sorghum came from the community press, boiled down in iron kettles every fall. Mountain families relied on it as their primary sweetener because sugarcane never grew at that elevation. By the time the 1970s came around, you could still find Dixie Dew syrup in some cabinets, the label claiming it gave a biscuit a college education, and old-timers found it funny and a little sad that you now had to buy what always came from a neighbor's press. The after-school ritual that needed no permission and no dish went quiet after that. Cracked green tomatoes were what you made the week before. Every tomato that hadn't ripened, sliced thick, dredged through cornmeal with salt and pepper, and laid into a skillet of hot bacon grease until the outside went golden and crackled and the inside softened just enough to give. They weren't the romanticized version that arrived in restaurants decades later. They were a practical harvest, a way of eating what would otherwise rot on the vine. The cornmeal crust transformed the chalky bitterness of an unripe tomato into something with texture and heat, and enough fat to feel like a meal. Mountain families in North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee had done this since the 19th century, using cornmeal ground at the nearest mill. You never added anything fancy to the dredge. The grease had to be hot enough that the slice sizzled the second it touched the pan. If it didn't, you'd waited too long. If you had to ask how hot the grease was, you weren't ready to cook them. The kitchens that grew cushaw in the garden often kept a crock of sauerkraut in the cellar, and what came out of that crock fed families through winters that started early and ended late. Kraut and Wiener casserole was German Appalachian cooking at its most practical, a dish built from two things that kept almost forever and cost next to nothing. The sauerkraut came from a stoneware crock where cabbage had been salted and pressed and left to ferment for weeks in the root cellar, and the wieners were the cheapest protein at the general store. You layered them in a baking dish with caraway seeds, a little brown sugar to cut the sourness, and sometimes sliced potatoes if the family was large and the wieners were few. It showed up in every holler and every coal camp kitchen from eastern Kentucky to southern West Virginia. It smelled sharp and sour, and it tasted like the kind of meal that got you through February. Number 30. Hoe cake with red-eye gravy. A piece of country ham about the size of a small saucer goes into a hot iron pan. 2 minutes aside is plenty, and the brown bits stuck to the iron are the whole point of the supper. A splash of black coffee deglazes the pan, and that thin red gravy is what gave the dish its name. The hoe cake is just yellow cornmeal, salt, and boiling water patted into a flat round and fried in the leftover ham grease until the edges turn the color of a copper penny. 1 ham slice, 1 hoe cake, 1 plate. That was supper in Madison County, North Carolina, on a Tuesday in November, and the woman eating it did not feel poor. She felt fed. The dish has lived in the mountain repertoire since the early 1800s, and a single portion costs about $1.50 at any country butcher. Number 24. Cooking 3 meals from 1 Sunday chicken. Cooking 3 suppers off 1 bird was the rhythm of every hillbilly Sunday. 1 roasting hen carried Sunday dinner, Monday soup, and Tuesday pot pie. The bird went into the oven with sage and onion until the leg pulled clean from the joint. Monday morning, the carcass simmered into stock on the wood stove rim. Tuesday, the leftover meat went into the broth with biscuit dough rolled into dumplings. 1 bird, 3 suppers, 11 plates, and the bones still make the broth in your kitchen tonight. Number 23. Leather britches beans strung on thread. In late August of 1955, the green beans came in by the bushel, and Jewel could not can them all. The glass jars cost money. Lids were still rationed in her memory from the war. So she sat on the cabin porch with a tin bowl of half-runner beans, a sewing needle, and a length of white cotton thread. She ran the needle through the middle of each bean and slid it down the thread like a bead. A full string held 100 beans. She hung the strings from the rafters of the cabin loft, out of the sun, and let them shrivel for 6 weeks. They looked like small leather breeches that had been soaked and dried. Back then, every cabin in Union County had strings of them swinging in the loft. Come January, she dropped a handful into a pot with fatback and water and simmered them 4 hours. Supper cost nothing but time. A quart jar of canned beans cost 14 cents, but leather breeches cost 0. Multiply by 40 supper nights and you see why she strung them every year. Number 18. Chess pie. Chess pie is what you make when you have almost nothing. A stick of butter, a cup of sugar, 2 eggs, a tablespoon of cornmeal, a teaspoon of vinegar, a splash of vanilla if you had vanilla, a pie crust because you could always manage a pie crust out of flour and lard. That is the whole architecture. It bakes into a gold, cracked top over a layer of something between pudding and candy. It is rich in the way a poor family's dessert is rich, which is to say, with the last of what was on the shelf used well. The Appalachian grandmothers who served chess pie at funeral dinners knew a quiet thing. A simple pie made from pantry scrapings says to a grieving family what a fancy cake cannot. It says, "I had you in mind. I stood in my kitchen and I thought of you." Number 23. Sawmill gravy and biscuits. The name came from the logging camps, where cooks stretched 1 pound of sausage across 40 hungry men by thickening the drippings with flour and milk until the gravy looked like wet cement. In a hillbilly kitchen in 1971, you did the same thing with a 1/4 pound of sausage, 3 tablespoons of flour, and 2 cups of whole milk. The biscuits went in the oven first. By the time they came out golden, the gravy was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. You split the biscuits open, ladled the gravy over the top, and ate it with a fork because a spoon could not keep up. Families in Boone County, West Virginia, made this for breakfast, for dinner, and sometimes for both when the paycheck ran thin. It was powerful fuel for a powerful day. Your grandmother did not call it comfort food. She called it what was on the stove. Number 17. Sorghum taffy. In the early 1960s, sorghum syrup was still the primary sweetener in many mountain homes. Refined white sugar was expensive. Sorghum was not. Families grew their own cane, pressed it in a horse-drawn mill, and cooked the juice down into a dark, thick syrup. When there was extra sorghum, the women made taffy. They boiled the syrup with a splash of vinegar until it reached the hard crack stage, poured it onto a buttered platter, and waited until it was cool enough to handle. Then the pulling started. Two people would stretch and fold the candy between them until it turned from dark brown to pale golden and went stiff. They snapped it into pieces and wrapped each one in wax paper. In the mountains of eastern Tennessee, communities held taffy pulling parties in the fall. Young men and women paired off to pull the candy together. It was one of the few socially acceptable ways for unmarried people to hold hands. The taffy was the excuse. The company was the point. Number 22. Molasses popcorn balls. Separate from plain caramel corn, molasses popcorn balls were a late fall tradition across the southern Piedmont and the hill country of Tennessee. After the sorghum press ran and the molasses came in, the first thing many children asked for was a popcorn ball. The molasses gave it a darker, earthier sweetness than plain sugar, heavier, more complex, with a faint tang that no modern candy can copy. You popped the corn first, made the molasses coating, and poured it over the top. You had to work fast because molasses sets quickly. You greased your hands with butter and shaped the balls while the mixture was still warm enough to move. Small hands burned sometimes. A gallon of sorghum molasses in central Tennessee in 1962 sold for about $1.25. That gallon made enough popcorn balls to fill a wash basin. That was the whole point. In August, when the pole bean crop came in faster than any one family could handle, the neighbors came. Chairs went out on the porch, wash pans filled with freshly pulled beans, and the work started. Break the tip, pull the string down the pod, snap the bean, drop it in. The sound was specific: a dry snap, a soft rustle, a hollow knock against the tin, hour after hour, set under conversation and children running in the yard. Bean stringing days were documented as community cooperative events across Appalachia as far back as the early 1900s. Women brought their best stories to bean stringing days. Some of those conversations are the last clear memory certain families hold of grandmothers now gone. Her voice, the smell of the beans, the weight of the pan. The beans went into jars or leather breeches or that night's supper. The day those hands made together was harder to put up. Bologna from the jar was a transaction you understood before you could read the handwritten price on the lid. The gallon glass jar sat on the counter of every Mountain General store. Dense rings of bologna in pale pink brine, a pair of tongs that you worked yourself, fishing out a thick slice and laying it on a soda cracker. The bologna went soft in the brine, turned sour and spongy, the vinegar tang cutting through the fat in a way no fresh deli slice could. A nickel, sometimes a dime by the end of the decade. Old men argued about whose brine was best. There were strong opinions. A general store owner in Pike County, Kentucky, reportedly never wrote down his pickling recipe, and when he died, his regulars grieved in a way that surprised their families. It was just bologna. Everyone who had ever stood at that counter knew it was not just bologna. The jar disappeared when the stores closed. Nothing replaced either. Cushaw was a hillbilly squash that most of the country never heard of. A large, crook-necked, cream and green-striped gourd that grew heavy on the vine in Appalachian gardens from Virginia down through Georgia, one of the few crops robust enough to thrive in Rocky Mountain soil. Its roots went deeper than European settlement. The Cherokee had been cultivating Cushaw for centuries before Scots-Irish settlers arrived, and those settlers learned to grow it from the people who already knew. The same way they learned corn and beans. Sliced thin and laid into a hot skillet with butter and a sprinkle of brown sugar, it cooked fast, the sugar caramelizing at the edges, the flesh going soft and sweet and slightly stringy in a way that butternut or acorn squash never managed. Appalachian food writer Ronnie Lundy, in her James Beard award-winning cookbook Victuals, described Cushaw as tied to mountain memory in a way that nutritional language alone cannot hold. The Foxfire Fund in Mountain City, Georgia, still works to preserve heirloom crops like Cushaw, but the women who knew the exact moment to pull it from the pan are mostly gone. Hash brown funeral potatoes earned their name the hard way. They showed up after someone died. The recipe started in Mormon communities in Utah, where it was a fixture at post-funeral luncheons, but by the middle of the 1970s, it had spread through church basements and potluck tables across the rural South and Midwest. The whole thing was built from frozen shredded hash browns, sour cream, a can of cream of chicken soup, a heavy pour of shredded cheddar, and a topping of crushed cornflakes fried in melted butter until they crisped into something almost candy-like. What walked into the kitchen as a bag of frozen potatoes and a stack of canned goods walked out of the oven as something rich and golden and deeply comforting. The kind of dish that could make a grieving family sit down and eat when nothing else could. The cornflake crust was the secret. Without it, you just had cheesy potatoes. With it, you had the dish that said somebody cared enough to bring their best to your worst day. Number 26. Sawmill gravy on one split biscuit. A spoon of bacon grease in a small skillet. A spoon of flour stirred in until it smells like toast. Then a half cup of cold milk whisked slow over low heat. Salt, plenty of black pepper, and nothing else. The gravy thickens in about 4 minutes and turns the color of unbleached linen. A biscuit split open underneath, the gravy ladled over, and supper is on the plate. Mill workers in Sevier County, Tennessee, ate this with whatever the day had left over, and the gravy got its name from the sawdust-looking flour gravy that flowed at the lumber camps. For one person at home, the recipe halves cleanly. The biscuit can be from a tube on a tired evening. No one in the holler ever held that against anyone. Number 23. Saving bacon grease in a tin can next to the stove. Saving every drop of bacon grease was the single most reliable trick in any hillbilly kitchen. She kept a Hills Brothers coffee can on the rear burner with cheesecloth over the top. Every morning, she poured the hot grease slowly through the cloth into the can. By Saturday, she had a half pint of clear amber fat that she used to fry cornbread, sear green beans, slick the biscuit pan, and start the milk gravy. 1 pound of bacon at the company store in 1964 ran 59 cents, and the grease was the cooking oil for the rest of the week. But she never bought lard, and she never bought shortening. The grease can never went empty because she never let it, and the woman who tended it that carefully made the rest of the kitchen budget stretch the same way. The Hills Brothers can held grease from Oscar Mayer bacon strips. Today, bacon costs around $6 a pound, and a bottle of vegetable oil costs almost $5. The same trick still cuts your kitchen budget in half. Number 25. Bacon grease saved in a tin on the windowsill. Jewel kept a tin labeled Maxwell House on the sill behind the cook stove, and the grease inside had been refilled for decades. Every morning in 1955, she fried 4 strips of bacon, lifted them out, and poured the warm fat through a square of cheesecloth into the tin. The next meal started with a spoon of that grease. Cornbread cooked in it, eggs cooked in it, greens wilted in it, beans picked up their salt and smoke from it. A jar of good bacon grease in a mountain kitchen was the difference between a meal that tasted like something and a meal that tasted like nothing. She did not throw it out when it turned dark. She said the dark grease was the best grease. That tin cost her nothing. And a store-bought pound of lard at the Blairsville A&P cost 21 cents. Over a year, she saved $11 keeping that tin full. Your grandmother probably had one too. Simple, cheap, effective. Number 21. Blackberry jam cake with caramel icing. The blackberries came from the fence line at the back of the tobacco patch. Every July, a grandmother would send 5 or 6 children out with lard buckets tied around their waists with baler twine and tell them not to come back until every bucket had a dark, heavy bottom. She spent the next 2 weeks making jam. A quart jar held about 14 cents worth of sugar and a summer's worth of work. That jam went into the cake at Christmas. 3 layers, spiced with cinnamon, allspice and clove, buttermilk for tang, a full pint of blackberry jam folded into the batter. Over it all, a sheet of caramel icing poured hot so it set into a thin sugar shell you had to crack with the side of your fork. Every serious Kentucky grandmother had a jam cake recipe and she did not share it. Not in writing. Not even with her own daughters, some of them, until the day she knew she was dying. Number 18. Fried apples. When the apple tree behind the house dropped its fruit in September, a hillbilly mother in Letcher County, Kentucky, carried a bushel basket to the porch and kept one handful at a time in her apron pocket. She sliced the apples into a skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease, a handful of brown sugar, and a shake of cinnamon. 10 minutes. That was it. The apples softened, caramelized, and turned the color of a wood stove at dusk. You ate them beside a slab of country ham or spooned them over hot biscuits. The apples cost nothing. The sugar was 18 cents a pound. One skillet fed a whole family. Your grandmother ate fried apples the way a New York banker ate dessert, and she did not need anyone to call it special. She called it Tuesday. Number 15. Vienna sausages and crackers. A small can of Armor Star. Vienna sausages cost about 15 cents in 1961. A box of saltine crackers cost a quarter and lasted a week. Together, they were the universal snack of every country store and coal camp commissary in Appalachia. You opened the can with the key soldered to the bottom, peeled back the lid, and fished out the little sausages with your fingers or a pocket knife. They were soft, pink, and packed in a salty broth. You put one on a cracker and ate it in 2 bites. Nobody pretended they were good. Nobody claimed they tasted like real sausage. But they were cheap, available, and required no cooking, no refrigeration, and no cleanup. In the hollows of Appalachia, where the nearest hot meal might be hours away, that was enough. Number 20. Circus peanuts. Before dollar stores, there was the general store jar. In rural communities across the Midwest, small towns in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, circus peanuts sat in glass jars on the counter of the dry goods store. Orange, banana-flavored, shaped like a peanut but made from nothing a peanut ever touched. They were sold by the piece at about 1 cent each through most of the 1950s and 1960s. Children who grew up in those communities remember them as the candy you got when you had only a penny and couldn't decide. Adults who grew up eating them either love them fiercely or find them baffling. There is no middle ground. The banana flavor came from an artificial extract that was the same formula used in banana-flavored medicine. They were simple. They were cheap. They were everywhere. That was enough. Nobody measured the cornmeal. You wet your hands, scooped from the bag, added salt water until the meal clumped without falling apart, and shaped it into an oval in your palms, flat on the bottom, rounded on top. Corn pone was older than the cast iron skillet itself. The earliest versions were baked on a hoe blade held over an open fire, which is where the name hoe cake came from in the communities that used both words interchangeably. Pone was the bread of weeks when a family couldn't spare the buttermilk or eggs that cornbread required. Nothing but meal, water, salt, and heat. The outside went hard and golden, developing a crust that crackled under pressure, while the inside stayed dense and slightly gummy, and that texture was the point. It held up in a bowl of beans without dissolving. You never used a spoon to shape it. If you needed a spoon, you weren't ready to make it. She shaped 12 pones in the time it took most people to find a recipe card, moving through the routine so automatically she could do it in the dark, and everyone came out the same. Peanuts in an RC Cola was the one ritual every mountain kid performed without being taught. Tilt the bottle slightly, pour the salted peanuts past the neck, feel them hit the cola and fizz up in a sweet salt cloud, then drink. The peanuts sank, then floated. Then you got both at once, cold carbonation and soft beer nut richness that no store ever packaged together because nobody needed to. RC. Cola had deep roots in Appalachia. Royal Crown spread through the mining towns and hollows long before convenience stores arrived. The miner's cola, the working man's 79-cent choice. The peanuts were Lance or Tom's, picked up at the register. Nobody told you the ratio. You watched someone do it once, your father, your uncle, some older boy at the filling station, and you knew. Your grandmother did it the same way her mother did. When she stopped being there to do it, nobody reached for those peanuts the same way anymore. The cold tomato gravy started in the bacon grease left from breakfast. A spoon of flour stirred in until the roux turned pale gold, then a quart of home-canned tomatoes dumped in and mashed down with a fork. The whole thing thickened in the time it took to split the biscuits. It wasn't a sauce. It was a gravy, and there's a difference any mountain cook would insist on, because a sauce is something fancy, and a gravy is what you make when supper has to come from the shelf. Families across Kentucky and West Virginia kept canned tomatoes year-round for this dish, putting up 40 or 50 quarts each August so that winter suppers had something red and hot to pour over bread. The trick was the roux. You couldn't rush it, and the women who made this knew the exact moment the flour changed from raw to ready just by the way the skillet smelled. You poured it over biscuits that were already cold, and the gravy brought them back to life. The last jar of tomatoes in February had a different weight to it, and she always said so. Yellow squash casserole showed up the moment the garden started producing faster than anyone could eat. You sliced it thin, no thicker than a nickel, because that was how the old women did it, and nobody argued with results. The squash went into a skillet with butter and sweet onion, cooked down just enough to lose its raw bite, but not so long it turned to mush. And knowing when to pull it off the heat was something you learned by standing at the stove, not from any book. The filling got folded with sour cream and cream of chicken soup, then buried under crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter. That cracker crust came out golden and shattered when you pressed a spoon through it. Every church supper in the rural South had at least two on the table by the 1970s, and the women who brought them knew whose was better without anyone saying a word. Most people overcook the squash now or skip the crackers entirely, and what comes out of the oven is close, but never the same. Number 28. Fried apples and a single pork chop. One thin bone-in chop, two firm tart apples cored and sliced into half moons, a spoon of bacon grease, and a pinch of dark brown sugar. The chop fries first in the heavy pan, comes out to rest on the plate, and the apples go into the same pan with the drippings still warm. 8 minutes. They soften, brown at the edges, and turn the color of an October hillside. The chop goes back beside them. A serving for one fits on a saucer. Joseph Dabney documented this exact pairing in his book on Appalachian foodways, and Ronnie Lundy called it the most honest pork dish in the mountains. The apples were usually limber twigs or wine saps from the back orchard, varieties most grocery stores stopped carrying after the 1970s. It tastes like a cool morning on a wood porch. Number 17, making egg gravy over torn biscuit pieces. The pan smelled like a sermon on payday morning. Your grandmother melted a tablespoon of saved drippings into a hot black skillet, stirred in a heaping spoon of flour, and browned it for 2 minutes until the roux turned a deep, toasted color. She poured in equal parts milk and water, whisked it smooth as silk, cracked one egg into the simmering pan, and stirred until the white set into ribbons through the sauce, like ribbons of cream through black coffee. She tore the biscuits over each plate with her hands, ladled the hot gravy over the chunks, and the kitchen went quiet for 10 minutes while the children ate. It filled them, warmed your kitchen, and carried a coal miner through 8 hours underground. 1 egg, a spoon of grease, 2 cups of liquid, 5 plates cleared in under 15 minutes flat. Number 21. Sorghum instead of white sugar. Jewel had not bought white sugar since 1951. The farm up the ridge grew sweet sorghum cane, and every October a neighbor ran the cane through a mule-drawn press, then boiled the juice down in a long copper pan over a wood fire for 8 hours. What came out was a dark, earthy syrup with a taste of malt and iron. She traded 4 dozen eggs for a 1-gallon jar, which amounted to about $1.60 in 1955 trade value. That jar sweetened her coffee, cornbread, apple butter, sweet potato pie, and the medicine she gave the children when they coughed. Here is what most people miss. Sorghum has more calcium, more iron, and more potassium than sugar. Jewel did not know the chemistry. She knew the jar lasted 3 months and cost her nothing but eggs. Your grandmother likely had one too, back in the pantry, going dark and sticky. And that was the working rhythm of a hillbilly kitchen. Number 22. Sugar on cornbread with sweet milk. This was not a company dessert. This was what a child got when a child was loved and there was nothing else. A wedge of hot cornbread broken into a thick china bowl, a teaspoon of white sugar if it was a holiday, a drizzle of sorghum if it was not, a pour of warm cow's milk over the top from the family cow, still faintly tasting of grass. The child ate it with a big spoon, sitting on a kitchen chair that was too tall, legs swinging. In Knott County, Kentucky, this was called cornbread and sweet milk. In Letcher County, they called it crumblings. In parts of West Virginia, they called it cornbread soakey. The name depended on the ridge. The feeling was the same. You do not forget the first time someone hands you something warm and sweet and tells you it is all for you. Number 17, Jiffy Cornmeal Mush. Jiffy Corn Muffin Mix cost 9 cents a box at the Williamson A&P in 1972. But hillbilly women did not always bake the muffins. They stirred the mix into a pot of boiling salted water, let it thicken for 5 minutes, and poured the hot mush into a loaf pan to set. The next morning, you sliced the firm mush into half-inch slabs, fried them in bacon grease until the outside was crisp and gold, and served them with sorghum syrup or a pat of butter. Breakfast cost under a dime per person. Women in Mingo County fed their children this before the school bus came, and the meal stuck to a coal miner's ribs until lunch. One box made 8 servings. A bottle of sorghum molasses was 65 cents and lasted a month. Nothing about it was fancy. Everything about it worked. Number 23, peanuts in a Coca-Cola bottle. You bought a 6-ounce glass bottle of Coca-Cola for a nickel. You bought a small bag of salted peanuts for a nickel. Then you poured the peanuts directly into the bottle. The salt hit the carbonation and the cola fizzed up. You drank and chewed at the same time. Nobody knows exactly who started this, but it was everywhere across the rural South by the 1920s, and it was still going strong in 1962. Farmers did it. Miners did it. Mill workers did it. A man working in a tobacco field had dirty hands. Pouring the peanuts into the bottle meant he did not have to touch his food. He could hold the bottle with one hand and keep working with the other. That was the genius of it. Not the taste, though the sweet and salty combination was good. The genius was that it let a working man eat without stopping. Number 23, chocolate drops. There was no Hershey's in most rural Appalachian kitchens, but there was cocoa powder, and cocoa powder was enough. A woman in Harlan County would measure out 2 tablespoons of cocoa, combine it with sugar, a small knob of butter, and a splash of milk, bring the whole thing to a boil, then drop it by spoonfuls onto wax paper. She didn't call it fudge. She called it chocolate candy, and she made it in under 15 minutes on top of the stove. A tin of cocoa powder cost about 30 cents in 1961, enough for 3 or 4 batches of drops, no oven, no fancy equipment, just a pot, a spoon, and enough confidence to know when the mixture was ready by the way it smelled. In mill communities across the Piedmont of North Carolina, this same method produced peanut butter drops by swapping out cocoa for peanut butter. Your grandmother did not need 2 recipes. She needed 1 pot and whatever was in the cabinet. Soup beans were started before anyone else was awake. The pintos had soaked overnight, and by the time the kitchen was light enough to see, she had a piece of fatback already browning in the bottom of the pot. Water in to cover, lid on low, and the beans cooked all morning without anyone being asked to watch. She knew by the smell when they were getting close. Soup beans were Monday food in most Appalachian households. The anchor of the week, something you could eat twice in a day without complaint because the pot just got better as the hours went on. By the 1950s, pinto beans ran around 14 cents a pound at the company store, and a pound could feed a family of 6 if the cornbread was thick. The beans went into the bowl, and the cornbread went in beside them. You used the bread to push the beans onto the spoon because that was the right way, and everyone knew it without being told. The variations were as personal as handwriting, and hers was the only one that tasted right. Paws grew in the low-shaded hollows near creeks, and you had to know where to find them. The trees gave no obvious signal, and the fruit did not survive being carried. The native Appalachian fruit ripened in late August into something that tasted like banana crossed with mango, a custard yellow flesh loose around large dark seeds. You ate it under the tree, splitting it with your thumbs, scooping out the flesh with your fingers, because the fruit bruised black and soft within a day of picking. This is why no one outside the mountains had tasted one fresh. Pawpaws are the largest fruit native to North America, eaten by Native Americans for thousands of years. Lewis and Clark relied on them for food in 1806. Appalachian families guarded their groves with silence and quiet misdirection. Your grandfather knew where 3 groves were. He showed your father one. He showed you the same one. The other 2 locations went with him when he went. Fried cabbage cost almost nothing. A full head fed a family of 5, and the only other ingredient was salt pork, which was the cheapest cut at the smokehouse or the company store. You shredded the cabbage coarse, got the skillet hot, laid the salt pork in until it colored, then added the cabbage all at once and covered the pan long enough for steam to wilt it. Then you took the lid off and let the water cook out until the edges browned at the bottom of the pan. The pinch of sugar was the secret. Not enough to taste sweet, just enough to pull the natural sugars out of the cabbage and help it caramelize, and the women who knew this never needed to say it out loud because they had learned it by watching. In Depression-era Appalachia, cabbage was one of the few vegetables that grew cheap and reliable in Rocky Mountain soil, and fried cabbage with side meat appeared on supper tables across West Virginia and Virginia coal country 3 and 4 nights a week without anyone considering it hardship. It tasted like something made with care. It was. Pinto bean and cornbread bake was not a recipe anyone invented. It was a combination so old and so natural that it felt like it had always existed, the way rain exists or hunger. Soup beans, what the mountain people called pintos, simmered low with salt pork or a ham hock, were the foundation of Appalachian cooking, the one dish that appeared on the table more than any other. The casserole version ladled those slow-cooked beans into a deep baking dish and poured cornbread batter directly over the top, so the bread baked on the surface and soaked up the broth from below. The bottom of the cornbread turned dark and soft and almost like a dumpling, while the top crisped into a golden crust that cracked when you cut through it. A raw onion sliced thick went on the side, and nothing else was needed. In the mountains, that was not poverty. That was supper, and it was enough. Number 21. Cat head biscuit with sorghum. A biscuit the size of a cat's head, made from self-rising flour, lard, and buttermilk, baked at 450 until the top is the color of a deer hide. Split it open while it is still hot enough to burn a thumb. A spoon of dark sorghum molasses goes inside, and the molasses melts into the crumb and runs down a finger. Loyal Jones wrote that in the southern mountains, the cathead biscuit with sorghum was supper for any man or woman alone in the house, and Joseph Dabney recorded the same dish across the smokehouse counties of East Tennessee. The recipe makes 4 biscuits at a time, 3 for now, 1 for breakfast. A jar of dark Tennessee sorghum lasts a single person an entire winter. The sweetness is mineral and almost bitter at the back of the tongue, nothing like store syrup, and a single biscuit fills the plate without crowding it. Number 18. Baking cornbread in an iron skillet with 3 ingredients. The Black Lodge skillet pulled from the oven smelled like dark honey and a wood fire all at once. One thing I rarely see modern recipes get right about cornbread is the preheat. The skillet had to be smoking before the batter went in, with a slick of grease coating the bottom, or the bread stuck and the crust never set. She shook yellow cornmeal into a bowl, added salt, and mixed in enough buttermilk and a spoon of bacon fat to make a thick batter. 22 minutes in a 400-degree oven. The crust came out crisp around the edges and tender in the middle. The recipe is still the recipe. 3 things and a hot oven. Number 22. Salt curing pork in the smokehouse. The hog was killed the first cold week of December in 1955 when the temperature held below 40 for 3 days straight. Jewel and her husband used 10 pounds of salt for every 100 pounds of meat. They rubbed it into the shoulder, the belly, the ham, every crevice. The meat went on waist-high shelves in the log smokehouse and sat for 6 weeks while the winter cold did the work a refrigerator would have done. Then a low hickory fire was built under the meat for 2 days until the ham turned mahogany. That ham hung in the smokehouse through the next summer. 1 hog fed the family for a year. Back then, a pound of cured ham at the Blairsville store cost 69 cents, but a home-cured ham from a home-raised hog cost nothing but salt and patience, and that is the math your great-grandmother ran every December. Number 23. Vinegar pie. Now here is one that will make a modern kitchen flinch. A cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of flour, 2 eggs, a half cup of white vinegar, water, a pat of butter, 1 crust. That is the whole recipe. No fruit, no cream, no nuts. Just vinegar, cooked until it turns, somehow, into a pale gold custard that tastes a little like lemon pie and a little like nothing you have eaten before. It was a February pie. It was a winter pie. It was a pie you made in the second week of a long month when the fruit cellar was down to the last 3 jars of apple butter and you still wanted to put something sweet on the table for a cold Sunday supper. Women in the hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, had this recipe memorized. They had to. They made it most weeks of January and February for the best part of a century. It fed 8 people for 9 cents. Number 25, soup beans and cornbread. Vera Justice set a pot of pinto beans to soak at 5 in the morning before she walked her oldest to the school bus. By 3 in the afternoon, the beans were soft. The broth was thick, and a hunk of fatback had melted down into the pot. The cornbread went into the skillet at 3:50. It baked while she set the table. You could feed 6 people for under $1. The beans were 29 cents a pound at the company store. The cornmeal was 40 cents for a 5-pound sack. The only rule was that the bread had to be hot enough to melt butter when it hit the plate. Women in coal camps from Logan County to Harlan County made this same meal on the same schedule because their husbands came home on the same whistle. It was not a peasant dish. It was a working dinner that honored a working man. That mattered. Number 22, cracklin' bread. Every fall, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the hog killing started, the women saved the cracklings. Cracklings were the crispy, golden pieces of pork skin and fat left over after the lard was rendered. You could eat them straight, and people did. The real prize, though, was cracklin' bread. Cornmeal, buttermilk, a pinch of salt, and a handful of those cracklings baked in a cast-iron skillet greased with lard. The bread came out dense and golden, with pockets of crispy pork through every bite. Children ate it after school. Men carried a wrapped piece in their coat pocket to the field. It did not need butter. The cracklings had already given it all the salt and fat a person could want. In the mountains of West Virginia, families waited all year for Hog Killing Day, and the cracklin' bread was the first reward. Number 25. Homemade lollipops. When a child in a coal camp in McDowell County, West Virginia wanted candy and there was no penny store within walking distance, a grandmother sometimes made lollipops on the kitchen stove. She boiled sugar, a splash of water, and a drop of extract, peppermint if she had it, vanilla if she didn't, until the syrup went clear as glass. She poured it into greased bottle caps and pressed a toothpick into each one before it set. These weren't pretty. The color was amber or pale yellow. The shape was uneven. But they were sweet, and they were yours. Sugar cost about $0.10 a pound in 1962 in rural West Virginia. A batch of a dozen lollipops cost almost nothing. Children saved the sticks and compared them the way other kids compared baseball cards. No store-bought candy bar needed, no wrapper to throw away, just a hard knot of sweetness on a stick that lasted all the way home from school. The ones who did not know the preparation could have killed themselves. Pokeweed, the tall-stalked plant with dark purple berries that grew wild along Appalachian roadsides, contained phytolactotoxin through every part of its structure. Eating it raw or undercooked caused vomiting, convulsions, and in documented cases, death. But the people who knew understood that young spring leaves, harvested when the plant was still under a foot high, could be made safe through a preparation that could not be shortened. You brought a pot to a full rolling boil, added the leaves, cooked 15 minutes, and drained every drop. Fresh water back to the boil, cook again, drain again. Fresh water a third time, cook, drain. Only after 3 full cycles did the greens go into the skillet with bacon grease and onion, with scrambled egg folded in at the end. Salad was the Old English word for cooked greens, carried into Appalachian speech by early settlers. The dish was celebrated each June at the Poke Salad Festival in Harlan, Kentucky. You could only earn it by knowing what nobody had written down. Black walnut cracking was a community chore that doubled as a snack event, and the mountain method surprised outsiders every time. The walnuts came off trees in green husks that permanently stained everything they touched. Skin, clothes, pavement, dark brown black. First step, drive the car slowly over them in the lane to soften the husks. Then a hammer for the hard inner shell. The meat inside was bitter and intensely flavored, nothing like mild English walnuts in any store. You picked it out in small pieces with a nut pick, fingers stained for days, and ate it straight or stirred it into sweet bread cooling on the stove. Black walnuts are native to the Appalachian region. The Cherokee had harvested them for centuries, grinding them into pastes and pressing them for oil. By the 1970s, most households bought walnuts in a bag from the grocery. In the hollows, families still drove over theirs in the lane first. The grandmother who presided always ate the least and picked the fastest, and she made it look easy in a way it absolutely was not. Chocolate gravy is exactly the kind of dish that makes people from outside Appalachia raise an eyebrow until they taste it. In Kentucky and Tennessee mountain kitchens, it was made with cocoa powder, flour, sugar, and water. No milk, no butter, cooked until thick and glossy, then spooned hot over biscuits as a supper that was both meal and dessert, and neither one exactly. The recipe spread through families in the Cumberland Plateau, from women who knew that sugar and starch could fill a stomach as surely as any meat, and that children who refused beans for the third night running would eat without complaint if something sweet came with it. The wider food world discovered chocolate gravy in the early 2000s and called it Southern, but it was Appalachian first, specific to these mountains. Every family made it slightly differently, some using milk, some adding butter at the end, some keeping no written recipe at all. When your grandmother stopped making it, the version she made stopped existing, and the distance between her version and every other version closed to nothing. The weeks after deer season, the freezer was full and the kitchen adjusted accordingly. Ground venison and potato casserole was a hunter's wife's invention, a way to turn a freezer bag of dark, lean game meat into something the whole family would eat without complaint. The venison got browned in a cast-iron skillet with a generous pour of bacon grease because venison on its own was too lean and would dry out in the oven without borrowed fat. That was the trick nobody wrote down about cooking wild game. It needed the fat from something else to carry it. Sliced potatoes went in the bottom of the dish, then the browned venison, then cream of mushroom soup, then another layer of potatoes, and cheddar cheese melted across the top. In Appalachian communities from West Virginia to eastern Kentucky, this casserole showed up on weeknight tables all through the 1970s. It tasted like the woods and the wood stove and the pride of a family that fed itself from its own land. Number 23 on this list is leather breeches beans. Green beans threaded on cotton string with a sewing needle hung from a rafter in the back room in late August and dried for 6 weeks until they rattle when the wind moves through the house. The whole place smelled like cured hay for the first week. By Christmas, a handful went into a pot with water, a pinch of salt, and a thumb of side meat, and they swelled back to something close to their summer selves. The flavor is concentrated, smoky, almost like a green raisin. Verley Greer kept a string of them on the porch beam every winter, and Foxfire interviewers found the same string in nearly every old kitchen they walked into through the 70s. For one bowl, a half cup of dried beans yields a full single supper. The technique itself is what is forgotten, not the bean. Number 25. Stretching ground beef with oatmeal in the meatloaf pan. Stretching the meat was the simplest move in any hillbilly kitchen. A cup of rolled oats soaked in cold milk stretched a pound of chuck across 2 suppers. She mixed everything in a wooden bowl, packed it into a buttered pan, and baked it slow. What I didn't expect about a hillbilly meatloaf is that the milk soak does the work, not the meat itself. The oats need 10 minutes in the milk before the meat goes in, or the loaf falls apart cold the next morning. Number 16. Storing potatoes in sand in the root cellar. Jewel's potato crop, about 300 pounds from the backfield, went into the dugout root cellar behind the cabin the second week of October, 1955. Her husband had dug down 4 feet, lined the walls with field stone, and built a plank ceiling over it. Inside, she layered the potatoes in clean river sand from Coosa Creek, each one barely touching the next, the sand keeping them dry and dark and cool. A bushel of sand held 50 pounds of potatoes. The sand pulled moisture away from the skin and stopped the sprouts from starting. Not one potato sprouted before March. Every farm in Union County did the same, some with sand, some with sawdust, some with dry oak leaves. The temperature inside the cellar held at 48 degrees year-round. Jewel pulled the first spring potato in April, firm and fresh, 8 months after harvest. You can build a working root cellar in your backyard today for under $100. Number 25, dried apple stack cake. A woman in Perry County, Kentucky, would start this cake in the middle of September, the same week her apples came off the trees. She peeled the fruit, quartered it, threaded it on cotton string, and hung the string from the rafters of her back porch for 3 weeks until the pieces rattled like old leather. That is how she kept the taste of September alive all the way to Christmas. The cake itself was 6 thin layers, sometimes 7, each one more biscuit than cake. Flour, sorghum molasses, buttermilk, lard, 1 egg. She baked them in a cast iron skillet, one at a time, because she only owned the one skillet. Between each layer, she spread a dark, spiced paste of those dried apples, cooked down with water and a little sugar if she had it. The cake had to sit for 3 days before anybody was allowed to cut it. You do not rush a stacked cake, you wait for it. The folklore says a bride was counted popular by how many layers her neighbors brought, each woman walking up the path with a single thin round wrapped in a dish towel. Ella Mae's daughter had 11 layers at her wedding. Ella Mae cried for an hour. Number 24, fried bologna sandwich. In Mingo County, bologna was called poor man's steak, and nobody said it with shame. A thick slice hit a hot cast iron skillet, the edges curled up into a bowl, and within 90 seconds, it was done. You slapped it between 2 slices of soft white bread with a smear of yellow mustard. That was the whole recipe. Children carried these to the elementary school in Matewan wrapped in wax paper. Coal miners carried them down into the shaft in metal buckets. The bologna was 69 cents a pound at Piggly Wiggly in 1973. A loaf of bread was 35 cents. A family of 6 could eat for under $2. The sandwich was simple, it was hot, and it was on the table before your husband finished washing the coal dust out of the sink. Nobody called it cheap. They called it supper. Number 25, pickled eggs. Cecil Fugate was not the only man in eastern Kentucky selling them. Every country store, every gas station from Harlan to Hazard had a jar on the counter. Hard-boiled eggs, peeled and dropped into a brine of vinegar, salt, sugar, and pickling spices. They sat in that liquid for weeks. The whites turned translucent. The yolks went dense and creamy. A man could buy one for a nickel, eat it in 3 bites, and keep working for another 4 hours without his stomach growling. Just a jar, a pair of tongs, and a piece of wax paper if the store owner felt generous. In the coal camps of Harlan County, miners bought them by the half dozen before heading underground. The vinegar kept them from spoiling in the heat of the tunnels. Your grandfather probably ate 100 of them and never once called it a snack. He called it getting by. Number 18, vinegar taffy. The first time someone describes vinegar taffy to a person who has never eaten it, the reaction is usually a look. Vinegar. In candy. But cider vinegar was the acid that balanced the sweetness in old-fashioned taffy when cream of tartar wasn't available, and the result was a candy with a clean, bright flavor that tasted like something between butterscotch and lemon drops. Apple cider vinegar cost about 12 cents a quart in rural Virginia in 1963. The taffy was pulled by hand, 1 person, 2 hands, stretched and folded over and over until it lightened in color and turned glossy. In farm communities across the Shenandoah Valley and the Blue Ridge foothills, taffy pulling was a social event. Young people gathered on Saturday evenings, somebody cooked the candy, and the pulling happened with enough noise to keep the house warm. Nobody had to explain the recipe. Everybody already knew it. That is what tradition means. The tins sat on the back of the stove all year, a squat coffee can or old lard pail filled with pale amber fat that never fully hardened. Every morning after the bacon came off the skillet, She tipped the pan and poured the drippings in, straining out the black bits. You never washed that tin. You never refrigerated it. The fat cycled naturally. Fresh drippings on top, older fat used from the bottom, and it stayed sweet and functional for months without spoiling. It greased the skillet for cornbread. It wilted the lettuce. It finished the green beans. It carried the flavor of every piece of pork that had ever cooked in that kitchen, layered into something richer than any single ingredient could manage. Through the 1930s and 40s, lard came in 50-pound tin pails from the store, but bacon grease was free. It cost nothing but the habit of attention. When she stopped cooking, nobody thought to save the tin. That was the first thing that went. But years before any hillbilly snack came wrapped in cellophane, your grandmother was already in the garden eating tomatoes off the vine with a pocket knife and a salt shaker from her apron pocket. Sun-warmed tomatoes halved over the palm, salted directly on the red flesh. No kitchen, no dishes. The salt drew out the juice immediately. You ate fast, standing between the rows, the warm liquid running down your wrist. Appalachian families grew open-pollinated varieties passed from neighbor to neighbor for generations, softer, thinner-skinned, more acidic than anything bred for shipping. The tomato bled when you cut it. The salt shaker was always in her apron. When she stopped going to the garden herself, nobody thought to put one in their pocket before walking out there. Bulldog gravy was what you made when there was no meat at all, also called white gravy or milk gravy or just gravy with no qualifier. It started with whatever fat you had, a heaping spoon of flour stirred in until the roux thickened, and then milk or water poured in slow. In Appalachia, the version made with water instead of milk was sometimes called poor gravy, even by the people who ate it, because they knew the difference and they felt it. You poured it over day-old cornbread that had gone dry, and the gravy brought it back to something that could fill a stomach. In Kentucky and West Virginia, mining communities during the Depression, and again during the coal slowdowns of the 1950s and 60s, this was what supper looked like on the worst weeks of the month. Not a figure of speech, just the actual food on the actual table. The children who ate it grew up and moved to cities and never made it again, and some never told their own kids it had existed. If cabbage rolls taught you how to stretch a meal, 7-layer casserole taught you how to stretch a prayer. The whole trick was that the rice went in raw, uncooked, straight from the box, and the liquid from the tomato sauce and the fat from the bacon on top cooked it in the baking dish. You layered it in order, and you did not skip a step. Rice on the bottom, then ground beef crumbled raw, then tomato sauce, then onion rings, then bell pepper rings, then celery, then strips of raw bacon draped across the top like a blanket. Covered tight with foil, it baked for 2 hours, and the whole house filled with a smell that brought the kids in from the yard without being called. The recipe showed up in community cookbooks all through the 1960s and 70s, always handwritten, always from someone named Dorothy or Mildred. It cost almost nothing. It fed almost everyone. Number 19. Fatback and pintos. A square of cured fatback about 2 inches across rendered in a small, heavy skillet until it gives up its grease and turns into a brown crackling. The cracklings go on top of a bowl of plain pintos. The rendered grease goes into the bean jar for next week. Nothing wasted. The dish takes 10 minutes, and a single supper costs about 40 cents. A widow in Greene County, Tennessee, can finish the whole bowl with 1 biscuit on the side and call the kitchen closed for the night. The cracklings on top are what most of the family will reach for first. Number 22. Buying chicken backs and necks for scraps. Buying the bony parts of a chicken instead of the breast was the trick that fed twice as much for a third of the price. The butcher trimmed the parts the town families never wanted and sold them by the pound. They went into a heavy iron pot with cold water, half an onion, and a celery rib. 3 hours of simmer pulled every shred of meat off the bone. Spoonfuls of biscuit dough fell into the broth. The pot turned into tender shredded chicken, thick yellow broth, and pillowy dumplings. An old hen makes the strongest stock. Number 15. Lye soap for cutting grease off iron skillets. Jewel made lye soap once a year, the first week after hog killing in December 1955. She poured rainwater through a barrel of hickory ash to draw off the lye, then stirred the lye into a kettle of rendered hog fat over a slow fire until it traced. She poured it into a wooden trough and cut it into bars after 2 days. That soap was not pretty. It was tan, rough, and it smelled like the barnyard. A sliver of it, rubbed on a greasy wash rag, cut grease off the floor, the table, the children's knees, and the black iron cookpots in one pass. She never used it on the seasoned skillet. Lye soap would have stripped the black right off. She kept it for the plain iron and the kitchen floor. The hog gave her a year's worth of soap in one afternoon. A bar of ivory at the store cost 10 cents in 1955. Jewel made 40 bars from one hog. Your great-grandmother did not buy soap for decades. Number 17. Buttermilk pie. Buttermilk was not wasted in a hillbilly kitchen. Not ever. What was left after the butter came out of the churn went into biscuits, into pancakes, into the dog's bowl on a hot afternoon, and once or twice a month, into a pie. A cup and a half of buttermilk, a cup and a half of sugar, 3 eggs, a stick of butter, flour, lemon if a neighbor down the road had brought one up from Tennessee. The custard set creamy and tangy with a thin, crackled sugar skin on top. A farm wife in Owsley County named it a desperation pie because she made it in the weeks before the first peach came ripe. Her children called it the best pie she made, but she never believed them. Number 20. Wilted lettuce with bacon grease. In the spring, when the leaf lettuce in the garden was tender and the coal camp commissary had not yet stocked the tomatoes, a hillbilly woman would tear a bowl of lettuce, slice a green onion over it, and pour hot bacon grease straight from the skillet across the top. The lettuce collapsed in 3 seconds. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in next, then a crack of black pepper. You ate it while it was still warm. That was it. Women in Pike County, Kentucky, served this beside a pot of soup beans and a wedge of cornbread. It took 90 seconds to make. The lettuce came from a garden that cost nothing. The bacon grease came from the tin by the stove. It was the first green thing the family had tasted in 4 months, and it tasted like a promise that the hard part of winter was over. Number 14. Sassafras tea. In the early spring, before the trees fully leafed out, children in the mountains dug sassafras roots from the edges of fields and woods. The roots were easy to spot because the whole plant smelled like root beer. You washed them, cut them into pieces, and boiled them in a pot of water until the liquid turned a deep reddish brown. Then you added sugar or honey and drank it warm or let it cool. Sassafras tea was free. It grew everywhere. And it tasted exactly like root beer because root beer was originally made from sassafras. In the 1960s, every child in rural Appalachia knew how to find a sassafras tree. They knew it by the smell, by the mitten-shaped leaves, by the way the bark peeled. Grandmothers said it purified the blood. Whether that was true did not matter. What mattered was that a child could walk into the woods with nothing and come back with something that tasted sweet and warm. That is what foraging meant to mountain children, not survival, discovery. Number 19. Sorghum balls. In the hills of eastern Kentucky and the mountain communities of southwestern Virginia, a candy was made that required no stove and no heat. You measured out sorghum molasses and peanut butter in equal parts, worked in enough powdered sugar to make the mixture firm, and rolled it between your palms into small balls. Then you rolled those balls in cocoa or crushed peanuts or powdered sugar and set them on a plate in the cold pantry to firm up. That was the candy. Sorghum was the sweetener mountain families had when money ran out or the store was too far. A family with a half-acre of cane and access to a community press could make enough molasses to sweeten every dish all winter. The sorghum ball was the candy that required nothing from a store. In Letcher County, children gathered around a wooden table on cold December afternoons and rolled them by the dozens. No stove required, no pots to wash. The lettuce had to be fresh, still cool from the garden, because the whole point was the contrast. You filled a wash pan with torn green leaf lettuce and thin-sliced spring onions, salted it light, and went to the skillet. The grease had to be smoking. Not warm, not hot, smoking. with a shimmer past ready. You poured it straight over the raw greens in one long stream, moving slow so the heat reached every corner, and the lettuce collapsed on contact with a hiss, wilting to a third of its volume in seconds. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in next, and sometimes crumbled bacon across the top. Kilt lettuce appeared on Appalachian tables from late March through late May in Harlan County and across the Kentucky mountains when the new garden was coming in and the winter's preserved food was finally running thin. She made it in a washpan big enough for the whole family and served it piping hot. Nobody has got peanut butter and Caro syrup fudge was made in a bowl without a stove, a thermometer, or much patience. Spoon peanut butter into a bowl, pour Caro corn syrup over it, stir until it stiffened into a dense, sticky mass that held its shape when you pinched off a piece. That was the candy. Hard in the refrigerator, soft in a warm kitchen, eaten off the fingers or rolled into balls and dusted with powdered sugar. Mountain women called it poor man's fudge, which was accurate. Real chocolate fudge required a candy thermometer and cream, neither guaranteed. Caro and peanut butter were always in the cabinet. Corn syrup had been a staple in Appalachian kitchens since the early 20th century when cane sugar was too expensive and peanuts from the Piedmont lowlands made peanut butter an affordable staple. Two cheap ingredients, one snack better than anything fancy. The women who made it never measured. You could not get it right if you measured. Chow chow was the relish that stretched a pot of pinto beans into a full supper, and every family in Appalachia who kept a garden made it differently. The foundation was always the same. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, hot and sweet peppers, salted overnight to draw the water out, then cooked in vinegar and sugar and packed into mason jars while the kitchen filled with sharp, sweet steam that meant fall and the end of the garden. Food scholar Mark Sohn, in his Appalachian Home Cooking, identified chow chow as one of the oldest continuously made condiments in the Mountain South, with roots in British Piccalilli and Cherokee preservation traditions. You spooned it over beans to replace the meat you didn't have, the vinegar cutting the starchy flatness of the pinto in a way nothing else managed. Some families made it hot, some made it sweet. The argument over whose version was better was an argument that never got settled, which is how you knew it mattered. If you knew what a cushaw was, you were from the mountains, and that was all anyone needed to know about you. The cushaw squash was a massive, striped, green and white gourd that could grow to 30 pounds or more on a single vine running wild through the garden. Mark Sohn documented it as one of the signature vegetables of Appalachian home cooking, a food so tied to the region that most people outside the mountains had never seen one. You split it with a hatchet because no kitchen knife was big enough, scooped the seeds, and baked the flesh until it turned soft and sweet as pumpkin, but lighter, smoother on the tongue. The casserole version mashed it with brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, and a little vanilla, then baked it in a dish until the top caramelized and the edges darkened to amber. Old-timers saved the seeds every year, passing them to neighbors, keeping the strain alive. When the last person who saved those seeds stopped planting, something older than any recipe disappeared with them. Number 18 is chicken and dumplings from a single hen. A whole stewing hen poached in salted water with a celery rib and an onion until the meat falls off the bone. Strip the bird, roll out flat dumplings the thickness of a nickel, cut them into squares with a butter knife, and drop them into the broth one at a time so they cook through without sticking. One hen yields 4 single suppers, and the remaining dumplings freeze in pint jars for the next 2 lunches. Mountain families did not waste a bird, and the modern freezer-to-bowl version of this dish is closer to what an Appalachian widow always did than to anything in a chain restaurant. The broth itself becomes a thermos of warmth the next morning. Number 20. Frying yesterday's mashed potatoes into supper patties. Frying the leftover mashed potatoes was the simplest second-act supper a hillbilly kitchen ever served. The cold potatoes got scraped out of the icebox bowl, mixed with 1 beaten egg, 2 spoonfuls of flour, salt and black pepper, and a fistful of chopped green onion. The patties were shaped on a wooden board, dredged each side in cornmeal, and laid into a hot greased skillet for 3 minutes per side. The outside went golden brown, and the inside held tender. 3 patties with a slice of cold ham and a spoon of chow chow fed a child to bed full. Number 14. Eggshells dropped into the coffee pot. Jewel drank her coffee strong and clear. She used a blue enamel percolator on the cook stove, coarse ground Louisiane that cost 31 cents a pound, and a trick her grandmother had taught her back in 1910. After she scooped the grounds into the basket, she crushed 1 clean eggshell in her fist and tossed it on top of the grounds. The albumin in the shell bound the grounds together and pulled them to the bottom of the pot. The alkaline calcium carbonate cut the bitter edge off the acid. The coffee came out smooth and amber, not muddy. An egg a week was a cheap price for clear coffee. This was a working trick every cattle drive cook in the West used in the 1880s. The mountain women had it too, and they used it without knowing it was famous. The shell went in the scrap bucket and fed the chickens. Your grandmother's coffee may have tasted better than yours for this reason. Number 16. Persimmon pudding. Wild persimmons are not friendly fruit. Bite into one before the first hard frost and your mouth will turn inside out. But wait for the frost. Gather the soft orange fruit off the ground under the tree. Push the pulp through a colander to get the seeds out. And suddenly you have a sweet, dark, honey-flavored mash that tastes like the woods in October. The grandmother in Wise County, Virginia, stirred the pulp into a batter of flour, sorghum, buttermilk, an egg, and a spoon of soda. She baked the pudding in a sheet pan over a slow fire for 90 minutes. It came out dense, dark brown, slightly spongy. Cut into squares, eaten warm with a pat of butter melting into the top. A pudding made of a fruit that grew for free on a fence line. 30 cents worth of flour. Nothing else needed buying. Number 15. Ramp and potato hash. In April, when the ramps came up in the hollows of Randolph County, West Virginia, a hillbilly cook would walk the ridge with a burlap sack and come home with a pound of green leaves and white bulbs that smelled like onion and garlic hit with a hammer. She diced the ramps fine, tossed them into a skillet with cubed potatoes and a spoonful of bacon grease, and cooked the whole pan for 11 minutes. You could smell it from 3 houses down. Ramp and potato hash was a free meal because the ramps cost nothing and the potatoes were a nickel a pound. It was the taste of spring in a coal camp, and for many families it was the first hot green meal after a long winter of dried beans and canned tomatoes. Number 16. Poke salad. In April, when the first green shoots pushed through the forest floor, families went out to pick poke. The young leaves of the pokeweed plant were free food, growing wild along fence rows and creek banks. Pokeweed is toxic, though. The mature leaves and berries contain compounds that can make a person seriously ill. The trick was to pick only the youngest shoots, no more than 6 inches tall, and boil them in 3 changes of water to draw out the toxins. After the 3rd boiling, the greens were safe. People ate them fried in bacon grease with a little salt, sometimes with a fried egg on top. In the coal camps of eastern Kentucky, poke salad was the first fresh green food people ate after a long winter of canned goods and dried beans. It tasted like spring. It tasted like the end of something hard and the beginning of something easier. Number 15. Coconut candy balls. Sweetened shredded coconut was one of the few exotic ingredients available in rural general stores by the late 1950s, and women across the Ozarks of Missouri and Arkansas learned quickly that a can of sweetened condensed milk, a bag of coconut, a handful of powdered sugar, and a few drops of vanilla made a candy that required no cooking at all. You mixed the coconut and sweetened milk until it would hold a shape, rolled it into small balls, and set them on waxed paper to firm. Some women dipped them in melted chocolate. Some rolled them in more coconut, some left them plain. In the Baptist church communities of the Arkansas Hill Country, these appeared on every covered dish table during the Christmas season. A can of sweetened condensed milk cost about 25 cents in 1961. That single can made 3 to 4 dozen pieces. That is a Christmas plate for under $1. Hominy started with dried corn soaked in lye water, an alkaline solution made from wood ash, until the hull of each kernel loosened and the corn swelled to nearly twice its size. The process was nixtamalization, though that word never appeared in mountain kitchens where it had been practiced for generations. The critical knowledge was how to make the lye water right. Wood ash from a clean hardwood fire went into a barrel. Water poured through slowly and collected below, and the resulting liquid had to be strong enough to float a raw egg before it was ready. Too weak, and the corn would not hull. Too strong, and it dissolved. She knew by the color and the way it moved, knowledge learned by watching her grandmother, never by asking. In Cherokee cooking, nixtamalization of corn dated back centuries before European contact, and the Appalachian settlers who inherited the technique gained one of the most significant food processes in North American history. The hominy that came out had a silky, tender chew that nothing canned has matched. Chow chow on a saltine was a snack the relish never expected to become. It was made as a condiment, cooked at harvest end when the last of the garden had to go somewhere before frost. Cabbage, onions, green tomatoes, hot peppers, sweet peppers, vinegar, mustard, celery salt, turmeric, everything processed and canned in hot jars that lined the cellar shelves. Come winter, you opened a jar and spooned a bit onto a saltine, and what you tasted was the entire garden concentrated into a single sharp, tangy, spiced bite. Chow chow is a Southern and Appalachian tradition with uncertain origins. Some historians trace it to Chinese railroad workers who brought pickled vegetable condiments west, others to French colonial preservation traditions. What is certain is that no two families made it the same, and the recipe that made your grandmother's version right died with her, because she never used a recipe at all. She made it until the garden stopped giving enough to justify the canning. Then she stopped. Squirrel was free, and in the hills of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, free meat meant everything when the alternative was money the family didn't have. A single gray squirrel filled a skillet. 2 or 3 made a proper supper. Brown the pieces in hot lard until the outside crisped. Pull them out. Add flour and water. Stir until the gravy thickened and turned a deep brown. And what you had was something wild and slightly nutty that no store-bought package ever matched. The squirrel hunting season in Appalachian communities was a social institution. Men and boys went out together in the early morning the way their fathers had, and what came back fed everyone for days. Mark Sohn, the food historian and author of Appalachian Home Cooking, documented squirrel gravy as one of the defining dishes of mountain Kentucky food culture, a dish that required no recipe because the women who made it had been making it their whole lives, as had the women who taught them. The knowledge lived in the hands, not in any written-down place, and when the hands stopped, so did the gravy. Galloped corn came together in a mixing bowl with the kind of ingredients that never needed a recipe card. Whole kernel corn drained and saved, cream-style corn from the can, eggs cracked in one-handed evaporated milk, and a sleeve of saltine crackers crushed by fist inside the bag. In parts of Ohio and the rural Midwest, Swiss cheese got folded in, a tradition that likely came from the Amish communities who sold their cheese at local markets for almost nothing. The casserole baked at 325 until it set like a custard in the center and turned golden at the edges. You tested it the same way you tested cornbread, a bump of the pan, watching to see if the middle still shook. Your grandmother made this for Thanksgiving and Christmas without fail, and the dish came to the table in the same ceramic baking pan every single year. She never wrote the recipe down because she never needed to. After she was gone, 3 different cousins tried to make it from memory. None of them got it right. Number 20. Brown beans with a slice of raw onion. The same pinto pot as number 22, but cooked plainer and served with a thick slice of white onion laid right on top of the beans. A small piece of cornbread on the side. Hill country families in McMinn County ate this 2 nights a week from October to April. The onion sweats into the broth and turns the whole bowl into something sharper than its parts. For one person, a coffee mug of beans and 1 slice of onion is a meal that a working hand could finish standing up. The leftover broth goes into a thermos for the next day's lunch, and nothing in the pot ever ends up in the chicken bucket. The dish is what a hill widow eats on the days when nothing else needs doing. Number 19. Fried hand pies with dried apples, not baked, not oven puffed. Fried, in a black skillet, in an inch of bacon grease. Half-moons of biscuit dough folded over a spoonful of those same dried apples from the porch rafters, stewed down with a little cinnamon and whatever sweetener was in the jug. The crimped edge was sealed with fork tines. The pies went into the hot grease for 2 minutes aside and came out dark gold, blistered, hissing. On Sunday afternoons in the coal camps outside Harlan, a miner's wife would make 24 of them at once, wrap them in a clean flour sack dish towel, and a man carried 6 of them down into the mine the next morning in a tin lunch bucket. They were still warm at breakfast. That was the trick of the hand pie. It traveled. Number 14. Candied apples. Before candy apples became a county fair novelty, they were a late autumn treat in farm communities across the South and Midwest, made with apples too small or too tart to eat fresh. A woman in a Tennessee Valley community would take the seconds from the apple harvest, the knobby ones, the ones with soft spots cut out, skewer them on sticks from the woodpile, and dip them in sugar syrup cooked with a handful of Red Hots for color. Red Hots had been sold at general stores in bulk since the 1930s, just a few cents a handful. The apples were free. In farm communities across Appalachia where orchards were plentiful, this was the candy that appeared in late September when the apples came down and the first cold air arrived. Children ate them standing in the yard. The syrup cracked when you bit in. The apple underneath was tart. You ate it down to the core and chewed on the stick. The peanut butter and raw onion sandwich never made it onto any menu or into any cookbook, which is exactly why the people who grew up eating it remember it the way they do, as something specific to a kitchen where nothing got wasted and protein came from wherever it could be found. A thick smear of peanut butter on white bread, a few rings of raw white onion laid across it, pressed together, and supper was done in 2 minutes. In the Depression years, when meat was scarce in Appalachian coal towns, peanut butter was among the cheapest sources of fat and protein on company store shelves. Regional brands had been stocked there since the 1920s, and raw onion added the sharp bite that made it feel like a meal. Nobody puts it on the table for guests now, but the people who ate it as children still remember the specific sting of the onion against the sweetness, and some of them still make it alone, quietly. Cornbread dressing casserole started the day before, always the day before, because the cornbread had to go stale. You baked a full skillet of buttermilk cornbread, crumbled it by hand into a bowl the size of a wash tub, and let it sit on the counter overnight with a towel draped across the top. The next morning came the sage, rubbed sage, never ground because ground sage turned bitter and only someone who had never made dressing would use it. The broth came from giblets and the neck simmered low with onion and celery until the kitchen smelled like Thanksgiving, even if it was just a Tuesday. Eggs bound it, and the whole thing went into a cast-iron skillet greased with bacon drippings. It baked until the top went crisp and dark while the center stayed soft and almost custard-like. Every family had their own version, and every family believed theirs was the only right one. When the woman who made it passed, Thanksgiving lost something the recipe card could never give back. Tell us in the comments which one your family still cooks and which one only your grandmother knew. The pinto beans, the cornbread broth, the skillet supper she left simmering when she walked the long way home from the company store. Set one of these on your stove this week. Stretch the dollar, stretch the meat, stretch the hour you spend standing at your own iron pot. Cook for 1 or cook for 10, the math still works. Because these meals were never about going without. They were about staying full when the world had already decided you wouldn't.